lastly, I hope we talk about the sort of dive deeper with the Addis Ababa crowd, because I actually think that Addis Ababa is like its own ethnic group in many ways, because whether you're Amhara or Tigrayan or whatever, I mean, like, there are many friends that I have who were born and raised in Addis and don't really identify readily with any immediate ethnic group, just because these metropolitan areas are such a melting pot in many ways, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing, but I do hope that we can dive a little deeper on that, because it's very fascinating.
Yeah, before we move forward, I was actually hoping that you guys could talk about that, because as a Eritrean, I'm not really privy to what you guys are really speaking to, so I would love to hear more about that, if you don't mind, Mastish and Ayantu.
Let me respond to Ayantu. She threw a very tricky question in there. So here's the thing. I think when Addis Ababa people, and I'm learning Ayantu now, like I'm actually meeting my friends like for the first time again, because I'm like, I thought you actually believed in X, and now like I feel like you weren't authentic about what you believe. But I think for me, genuinely, I think ethnicity currently in Ethiopia is part of the popular imagination more than other identities, obviously, and I don't think it's something that is necessarily bad or something that has to be like abolished or sort of legislated out, like some people are hoping to do now with the change of the constitution. But I think the Addis Ababa crowd it really feels like with the sort of emergence of multi-ethnic parties that are, I think, cognizant of the country's very complicated and really sad also history of grievances and lots of sort of injustices, right? Parties that recognize that can build a type of politics that will compensate for those things, but still allow us to like sort of imagine a multi-ethnic Ethiopia and one that's not going to be sort of putting rights and obligations on the basis of, or entitlements on the basis of ethnicity. And I think generally, I think that's a healthier society where, the identity that you're born to just by happenstance, just because you're born to an Amhara parent or an Oromo parent or a mixed parent, you're not entitled to anything or you're not deprived of anything. I think in principle, that's what I believe. In Ethiopia, the history, sort of the pre-1991 history is romanticized by now, I believe, the majority of Addis Ababa clique or the Addis Ababa group that is kind of labeled as the unitarist, right, or the Ethiopianist, is romanticized for the reason that, people think, Ethiopians just loved each other, lived happily, never thought of ethnicity and language and all. Everybody spoke, what they spoke, and they just loved each other, right, and lived for, centuries until the TPLF came or EPRDF came and say ethnicity is important and legislated it or like constitutionalized. I don't buy that. And I think there are people who say, oh, we don't believe in this, but they actually do. And I saw that coming out in the past, 4 weeks. But I think that that narrative is wrong. But I also think the narrative that, everything and, prior to a recognition of ethnic grievances is dark is also not true. So I think that there is, like most countries that were characterized by conquest, like there's a lot of history that we have to deal with, we have to confront it, we have to speak about it, and then legislate and put in place policies that will address the systematic grievances, but then chart a way forward that doesn't really just stick to that. So that's what I subscribe to. But I will give you guys that like maybe I'm learning. Most of my friends who I thought believed the same way may not necessarily believe that.
Yeah. Thank you for clarifying, Mastish. I think I want to go back to something Sam said about Ethiopia being this like Addis Ababa being this like metropolitan space, because I think that I have a lot of friends who are a lot of Oromo friends who are, and also Southern friends who are from in and around Finfinne. And for a lot of them, especially for my Oromo friends who are Tulama, As we know, Addis Ababa was founded in 1886 on Tulama land. There was entire people, entire history, entire governance system, entire culture that was destroyed in the building of Addis Ababa. And for Oromos, that city is very alienating because everything Oromo, including the people who still are on the land, have been stripped out and there's no space for it. And so people in Addis who feel like their identity is represented in that space, who are Amharic speakers, and this is across different ethnic groups. It's not just Amhara. I'm not using that as a code word. It's the people who have come to this space. When Addis Ababa was founded as a garrison town, where settler soldiers with their guns literally subjugated the people and kept them from pushing back against the conquest. So that history is still with us. I was in a taxi in 2019, and there was this kid who got on the taxi and he didn't speak Amharic, he spoke Afan Oromo, and the taxi conductor was just so dismissive and so rude. And I was just for me, it's so common, but that really pissed me off, because why should that happen? Especially why should it happen to Oromos on Oromo land? The Oromos didn't go elsewhere. Addis Ababa came to them. But again, this is across the country, right? Because the garrison towns are almost everywhere, especially in the conquered territories. And the relationship that was established there necessarily creates this very toxic relationship between peoples. And I think part of the problem in Ethiopia is, as we're trying to navigate this shift, naturally, historically marginalized people want this unequal relationship to change. They want to also feel at home in their lands. But how do we talk about the systemic institutions and the systemic structures that maintain that inequality and that maintain this horrible alienation? And I think 1991 presented a really excellent opportunity. However, we know how the TPLF completely, undermined that. And also, I think one thing we don't talk about enough is post-1991, the narrative that was propagated by the TPLF is not so much unlike what Abiy Ahmed is doing now to Tagaru people. Because the TPLF also had this narrative that Amhara people are the problem rather than the system being the problem. And Abiy Ahmed is similarly now saying, if we could just get rid of TPLF, and it's often employed by various people on social media as if we can just get rid of the Tagaru, who are the ones who put in place this system. And also there's not recognition that this is a system that historically marginalized people fought for. It wasn't a system that TPLF gave to them as a favor. And there's often this kind of neglect of that. And people think the reason why people were cheering this war, Addis Ababa specifically, is because they think that the only thing standing between them and a new post-ethnic Ethiopia, which is really the most ethnicized Ethiopia, is the dismantlement of the TPLF as an entity. So, I have a lot to say about Addis Ababans, but I'm gonna leave it there.
And just to add to both of you, this is amazing. I hope for anyone who ends up watching this who's not Ethiopian, you're learning a lot about the sort of the deep intricacies of what's going on. And as I've been saying over the last 4 weeks, this is a multi-layered conflict. I think part of the issue is Western journalists, because you have to fill a 500-word column. It's Abiy came to power, relations with Eritrea normalized, Tigray refused to go along with the federal delay of elections, held an election, and then a war happened. I feel like that's the simplified narrative. And I understand you have to just dumb it down for your average sort of reader who's not going to care about the details. So a few things. One is, to Ayantu's point, the land history of Addis Ababa. This is precisely why the hashtag Oromo protests movement began. I mean, and I was warning against this. There was a panel discussion at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University that I was part of in 2014, where I was warning against the master plan, the Addis Ababa master plan process, which wasn't an inclusive process. It wasn't, there was no due process, and really just amounted to a land grab and forced evictions of Oromo, especially Oromo farmers and peasants in the periphery, which sort of, again, is a continuation of previous evictions and displacements. No actual compensation, again, no due process, and that just fueled the resentment. And so what we saw in 2014, 2015 really did result in Abiy Ahmed coming to power. And so, and again, a lot of that has to go back to the very sensitive status of Addis Ababa for Oromos. And so I think it's important that we just recognize that. And, you know, we may not fully understand what that anger looks like or what it feels like, but I think it's important just to try to understand it and recognize that the pain just exists there. You know, as a Tigrayan, I don't fully get it. You know, I can sympathize, but I may not be able to fully empathize with it. But it's important that we get there. A few things. So, you know, in Ethiopian history, oftentimes, you know, we talk about oppressors and oppressed, and I just want to recognize that, you know, all of us at one point were oppressors, and all of us at one point were oppressed, and it's just, you know, sometimes it's very easy to, like, you know, assign like straight blame. I mean, even as Tigrayans, you know, you go back to sort of, you know, the era of the monarchy, and I mean, you saw sort of the brute force of the emperors, including Johannes IV and Tewodros II and others who sort of, you know, rebuilt sort of the modern Ethiopian state along with Emperor Menelik after the era of the princes. But even with the era of the princes, there were some pretty crazy regional warlords, basically feudal warlords from all ethnic backgrounds who committed what charitably could be described as war crimes today. You know, the whole constitution, I think it was a damn shame that the OLF was kicked out of the transitional federal government. Obviously, there was a lot of power grabbing and power maneuvers in the background, and it's unfortunate that the transitional federal government, 1991 to 1995, did not include the OLF. And I agree with Ayantu that you know, the sort of demonization that every Oromo was an OLF member and every Oromo was a terrorist and a secessionist. That was the narrative under the EPRDF, and it fueled hatred and suspicion for everything and anything Oromo. And so, while yes, on paper, you know, especially with Article 39, that, you know, Oromo culture, language, history, whatever, may have been, you know, guaranteed under the Constitution. In reality, you know, the discrimination that you're talking about, that's something that I've observed, and that many of my friends have also observed. Just, you know, even you know, certain names that may not be sort of, you know, northern sounding or whatever, you know, have been people have been discriminated. People have lost jobs because of that, or haven't even been granted an interview or whatever. So that's something that we need to recognize. The term ethnic federalism doesn't appear in the Ethiopian constitution, actually. It's, you know, nations, nationalities, and peoples. And so, you know, and while they are all guaranteed equal status, we've seen obviously that's not truly the case with Ethiopia's federalism. You know, I think that the constitution did a remarkable job in sort of coming up with a real imperfect system, but it was something that I think was needed to keep the country intact. This isn't to say that what was true in 1995 is true today. I think this is to say, and I've said this again for the last 4 weeks, Ethiopia has not had a constitutional convention since ratifying its constitution. There's never been an actual popular discussion as to sort of where is the country now and where should it be going. And so this is, you know, and you know, Maso, maybe you could talk more about this as a lawyer, but I was hoping that we would see this, that Ethiopia would get to this point of saying, okay, we're in a crossroads. 2018, we're in a crossroads. Let's think about some of the deep structural reforms that we need to undertake before, you know, we start doing other things, right? I think, you know, what Abiy started doing was things that were nice, you know, sort of liberalizing the economy, whatever, but without the sort of basic structural reforms. It's sort of a house that's being built without a solid foundation, and so I saw that as really concerning. You know, Abiy, his reforms, it was like a car that was going at 100 miles per hour without a proper brake system or whatever. So I think that was really concerning for me. And then just very lastly, Ethiopia has never had a real truth and reconciliation process. And so, 1991, people were demonized and others were demonized. And we've seen that again in 2018. And I just hope that we, and right now there's a real question as to sort of how is the country going to, rehabilitate from this war. And I'm not entirely sure what the steps are, but whatever it is, it needs to involve a national political dialogue with all armed groups and all political groups, but it also needs to involve a real deliberate truth and reconciliation process where people can air out their grievances, but really find ways to move forward. And then very lastly, last two things. One is, and I had written about this years ago about the EPRDF was, I think that there has to be sort of a happy medium, to your point, Maswa. I don't think that celebrating, embracing your ethnicity, your nationality should not be an issue in Ethiopia. I think we need to recognize Ethiopia for what it is. It is a collection of distinct nationalities. It's a collection of distinct kingdoms and principalities that had been merged into a modern polity, a modern state. So I don't think that's a bad thing. But one thing that I had hoped for was more political parties in Ethiopia would find ways to bridge sort of a common narrative, a common understanding among people. For me, a lot of that comes down to the economy and finding ways to provide people with opportunities to grow. I mean, we saw this in Europe with a lot of European countries that are sort of multi-ethnic and multinational countries, for them coming together, and indeed the European Union coming together, it was about building economic opportunities and sort of creating a climate where people don't feel left out and where a particular identity may have the upper hand. And so that's something that was never really achieved in the sort of 30-year democratic project for Ethiopia, and that's something that I think needs to be achieved. People feel excluded from the country's economic growth. No one's denying that Ethiopia has made some serious gains over the last 30 years, but the question is who has benefited from it. And so I think that that's been a real issue, and I would have loved to see the EPRDF sort of morph into that, or other political parties now morph into that, where there's a common understanding, because one question that I've actually struggled to answer over the last few months is what actually binds Ethiopians together? Because the Ethiopian narrative that we know benefits people like me. I'm Tigrayan, I'm a Highlander, I'm Abyssinian, I'm Orthodox Christian. The narrative of the Queen of Sheba and all of that, like that benefits me because that's my direct history. It's what I'm comfortable with, but I know that that doesn't represent all of Ethiopia. Indeed, only 40% of Ethiopians actually speak Amharic. So, I think that there needs to be a conversation as to sort of what does it mean to be Ethiopian? And that's something that I don't think that the EPRDF actually ever defined. You look at China, and through centuries, sort of most Chinese people now identify as Han, as the Han ethnic group, over 90% do, but that's not true. But through brute force, people have become to sort of be accustomed as Han Mandarin speakers. So because that was attempted throughout Ethiopian history and is not the case, there is no singular Ethiopian identity. I think it's just important to sort of figure out what is it that binds Ethiopians? What is it that makes a nation or nationality want to be part of the Ethiopian Federation, and that they don't invoke the secession clause? I don't know if we've actually answered that. And so my hope is that in the coming years, Ethiopian political leaders and the Ethiopian population as a whole can sort of figure out what does it mean to actually be Ethiopian.
Oh, sorry. I just want to jump in really quick too on something that Ayantu mentioned that I found really interesting, is like that this sentiment of people in Ethiopia supporting this war because they believe like basically you get rid of the TPLF or you get rid of the Tagadu and you don't have to deal with this multi-ethnic federalism, right? Because they're at the root of the problem. I just find it really interesting. Something that I'm learning is that's like the same idea for like pro-government Eritreans, like the very, very irrational thinking pro-government Eritreans who support the dictator and who buy into this rhetoric of like the reason why Eritrea doesn't have like a university, the reason why we can't focus on a constitution or we can't focus on anything is because of Wayane and like everything that they're trying to do to destabilize Eritrea. That's been his main like rhetoric. So those people are supporting this war for the very same reason, which I just find pretty interesting, you know, because at the end of the day, this war is not going to benefit any of us, you know, and I think sensible people can understand that. But yeah, I just wanted to point out that that fact.
Yeah, it's super interesting for those folks because, and just, you know, the PFDJ regime in general, because as long as you're willing to just externalize blame when it comes to any issues that are going on in a country or in any unit, to be honest, right? Like that sort of process that exists, it's not about the object to which you're externalizing that blame, right? It's not about like whoever you're directing, like, oh, these are the cause of our problems, this boogeyman, whoever or whatever it may be. It's about, right, the internal issues that you're not willing to deal with and not capable of dealing with. And so I think in the Eritrean context, it's just interesting to see over, even during liberation time, like the ways in which sort of like the problems that exist within, whether it be EPLF or within the PFDJ, like there's always just going to be some other boogeyman. And so like TPLF no longer exists, right? Who's going to be the new boogeyman? Who's going to be the organization or the institution or the direct object of the blame of the Eritrean regime to get people off of really like the real issues that Eritreans have? And that's why, you know, if y'all were on Twitter today and you saw the tweet about, you know, the strategic depopulation of Eritrea is the blame of the UNHCR. Yamane Meskel was saying this. So it's like, wait, the UNHCR is what's causing Eritrean refugees out of the country, right? 5,000 people a month for all the years that Mark was saying is because the UNHCR. Now that's an interesting boogeyman to choose, but it's like, it doesn't matter who or what it is, there's always going to be a new one. And so it's we got to be mindful of that, and we have to be able to really just like point that out and call out the problems and obstacles as they are, as you just did, Mark, right? Like it's the ruling party, right? The ruling regime.